Everyone, welcome to my channel where we talk a lot about theology, the Bible, and mental health issues. We are starting a study. I'm starting a study on Micah, the Old Testament prophet Micah, and this will be an in-depth study, so you are welcome to go along this journey. I'm teaching this at University Baptist Church, and if you're interested, check it out if you're in the area. And so we are embarking on conversations about political tensions, global crises, spiritual decay. And I know all of that sounds very much like what we've been through the last year or two, for sure. So we will be talking about Micah, his time period, and what's going on. And there are several things we want to walk away in understanding this study. Is we want to understand more of who God is. There's no better way to understanding the God of the Bible than to partake of the entire canon of Scripture so that you can better understand God. Sometimes we spend all of our time only in the New Testament or only in certain books of the Bible, and that really does us a disservice in trying to comprehend and understand the God that we serve. Remember, we serve the God of the Bible. And so going back into the Old Testament and reading all of its material really gives us a better understanding of Him, of our Lord and our Savior. So it also gives us a view and understanding of humanity. Remember that Micah and most of the Old Testament is addressed to God's people. Well, we are Christians now. We do not live in a theocracy, but there are Christians all over the world. And we can certainly take so many principles from the Old Testament, certainly from Micah, to apply to our lives now. And it helps us to actually understand who we are. You know, we cannot understand ourselves without trying to seek God and to understand Him. And finally, it also, reading and studying in this manner helps us to perceive our days and times with God in the backdrop, doing sovereign things that we may not be aware of, but we really need to put on the lens of God's sovereignty, which means He's in charge ultimately of all things, and to understand our time of chaos in the spectrum of God he's doing things behind the scenes. And so we want to understand who God is, we want to understand who we are, and we want to be able to discern the signs of the times, if you will, as we look back to how He dealt with His people in Micah. So let's start with Micah. First of all, Micah was one of the minor prophets in the Old Testament, a very fiery prophet who was a contemporary with Isaiah. And some of the other minor prophets overlap with him as well, such as Hosea and Amos. So he prophesied during the kings of the south, Judah, King Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Well, Micah's name means who is like Yahweh the Lord. That's in 7 verse 18. And this is actually one of Micah's themes. And what better question to ask than that kind of question when you realize that they're living in a day and time where idolatry or the worship of other gods is at its height. So understanding that there's no one like Yahweh, there's no God like this God, this monotheistic God. And so that's a very pertinent question to be asking during their time, and certainly during our time as well, isn't it? So Micah, you have to realize, had a very deep sensitivity to the social ills of his day, especially as they affect the small towns and villages of his hometown. So there's a lot of, let's say, social crimes going on, spiritual abuse going on during his time, and he's very sensitive to that activity. And he comes out showing God's indictment against his people for participating in this kind of activity. Well, Micah is actually quoted in the New Testament, and so you see that he is considered a very important prophet. Although he was from such a small area there in Judah. He predicted the fall of Jerusalem, and we'll get into all of that as we start rolling out the material in Micah 1 through Micah chapter 7. And he predicted the fall of Jerusalem that came 100 years later. And this was a time that Jeremiah, the prophet, was prophesying against God's people. And so Jeremiah prophesied the same thing, and he even quoted Micah in that process. And so you can see through that Micah was considered a national prophet, a national respected entity, that he was quoted 100 years later by this major prophet Jeremiah. Well, Micah had contemporaries in this 8th century paradigm. So the 8th century BC was full of just a lot of activity, internal activity and tensions going on between Israel and Judah, but also external activities going on with the growth and the campaign of the Assyrian Empire. And so some of these 8th century prophets I've mentioned already was Amos. He was 750 BC. Hosea was 745 to 735 BC. Micah was 735 to 715 BC. Jonah was 780 to 765 BC. And Isaiah was 740 to 686 BC. So Micah and Isaiah actually overlapped the most. Their ministries were most alike, and it is almost certain that they met one another and talked with one another and during this very hostile time that they lived in. It would really be, there's an old adage that I think is spot on when you study this time period. The minor prophets, when they were rolling out their indictments against God's people, it's been said that one of the purposes of these prophets was to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comforted. And that is actually very true, because we have a lot of abuses going on during this time period, not only with the political tension and the power grabs that are going on throughout both the northern and southern kingdom, with the assassinations of the kings and the murderous activity and people's grab for power, but also on the spiritual end of things. We see that there's a lot of idolatry that is going on, which God had prohibited his people from doing. And we see that that these false prophets were emerging, and these false prophets were dealing out blessings to those people who could pay them money. So if you had enough money to give to these prophets, then you would receive a blessing from them. So this really correlates to our day and time, where there's a lot of false prophets that have infiltrated the church with this false gospel of name it, claim it kind of gospel, and all kinds of different gospels that are not in keeping with the New Testament. So we will definitely get to that as well. If I had a map here, I would show you the map of the region. But Micah dates his material to that of the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, which were all kings in the southern kingdom of Judah. So the events in the book of Micah took place from about 735 to 700 BC, and Micah's ministry began between 740 and 733 BC, and he ministered until this Assyrian invasion in Judah in 701 BC, because he records the distress that accompanied that invasion, and that's in Micah 1, 10 through 16, and 5 verse 6. So this book is dated around 700 BC. So the audience that this material was intended for at the time was Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom. So this is actually the entire theocracy of Israel. So it's really directed straight at God's people in this theocracy, and we will. The, so Micah's has threefold purpose in the writing. Number one, it was to present the nature of God's complaint against his covenant people. And because they had been burgeoning with evil activity and being led astray by false prophets and doing things that were against God's laws and against God's nature. So Micah definitely was meant to present the nature of God's complaint, and he lays out the complaint to his people. The second is that Micah wanted to proclaim the Lord's certain punishment of their many sins, that this had been going on for hundreds of years. The activities that were really began to be ingrained into both areas, both nations, both regions. And so he wanted to let them know what was going to happen if they did not change. And finally, the third thing was to predict God's sure salvation to come, centering in the appearance of the Davidic messianic deliverer. And that comes in chapter 5. And so although this is a very heavy study, it's a very somber study, you have to realize that there's levels of hope that's embedded in Micah, because he is predicting the activity of God, that God is going to bring about his kingdom with the deliverer. And of course, we know him as the Lord Jesus, and we see Micah allude to him in chapter 5. So we do see 3 cycles in Micah, and all 3 cycles have this dialectic of judgment and salvation, and you see all 3 sections take that into account. So with that bit of backdrop, we're going to go straight into the historical understanding of what led up to the activities that we see in Micah, and also we see in Amos and all of those other minor prophets. And so we really begin to see the beginning of the end for them during this time period. Well, so this time period was wrought with political, internal, and external tensions. We have like I said, the burgeoning of the Assyrian Empire. We have Egypt in the south that really resisted a lot of the activity that was going on with Assyria. A lot of times, at some points, they consolidated with them, but there was a lot of resistance there. We also see social crimes committed within Israel and Judah of oppression, injustice, and corruption. So the oppression took place with the poor landowners were really suffering because they were forced to borrow money, and at a usury overemphasis on a usury that they had to pay back of interest. And a lot of times they had to mortgage their property. Sometimes they had to mortgage themselves into slavery or their children into slavery. And God had forbidden them early on in the Deuteronomy to not take their brothers as slaves. And so we see that that's really started gaining a foothold. But also we see the spiritual decay situation as well, with God's people and his leaders committing adultery, propagating adultery among people and leading them astray, and also red-handed rebellion against God. And so the combination of this political, social, and spiritual demise or decay really ferments over hundreds of years, while God sent his prophets to tell them to stop doing these things and to repent, but they refused to do that. Well, the political arena was really full of plots and counterplots kings grasping for power. Like I said, you see a lot of assassinations and murders and just all of this manipulative national activity going on. And you also see a collapse of law and order in which neither life nor property was safe. And you really start to visualize what the condition of the society was in Hosea chapter 4, 1 through 3, and chapter 7, verse 1, when you see this sense of law and order start to collapse and this internal strife keeps growing. The social crimes really emanated fairly quickly, and Amos denounced them. And these social crimes really showcase the reality that there was brother against brother, class against class, and section against section. You see this political fragmentation of ideologies and groups, group mentalities, group ideologies working against each other, until Israel was no longer held together as a nation. That says a lot for us right now here in America, where we're really seeing this fracturing start to happen, and groups just coming together, fighting against groups, and this really causes a tearing effect within any nation. And it's really true. A house divided cannot stand. And so we're seeing this now, but certainly Micah saw this during his time. And certainly the spiritual decay was signified by the practicing of pagan idolatry. And this was not only what they worshipped, which were these false gods, but the way they worshipped with their debauchery and their drunkenness and their sexual licenses. That corroded the very fabric of the national character. So all of these things really started becoming part of the DNA, the national DNA embedded in this nationality and in these people. And that became a real problem because when those kinds of things start happening, you will quickly see jealousy and bitterness and unbridled self-interest, where Israelite turned on Israelite. We see this in Isaiah 9 and 19. And you also see them exhibiting barbarity that would have been shocking even among the heathen. And this took place during their own civil war in 2 Kings 15:6 and then Amos 1:13. Where you see the kinds of things they were perpetrating on one another because of their selfishness and their lack of God and worshiping God and doing as He had told them to do. So to understand the red hot idolatry and all of the activity going on, we really need to even go further back and understand it against the backdrop not only of Deuteronomy, the laws that God gave them, and I think it was chapter 28 and 29, where God says, if you do what I tell you to do, there will be blessings. And if you don't do what I tell you, there will be a lot of cursings. And so, but also to look on the backdrop of King Solomon. Now, all of us probably remember King Solomon as the man who was, of course, King David's son and the heir to the throne. But he was also this individual that God imparted great wisdom to early on. And he really became very wealthy. He really, the kingdom really grew under his ruling, whereas King David really solidified the kingdom. It was under King David that the temple was built, and also that the empire grew to its largest extremities in power, in influence, and in their building projects even. So King Solomon started out well, but he did not finish well with his life. He really began to do things like enforced state slavery on the Israelite people. It was an enforced labor for the state, and this was categorically against what God had commanded of the kings to not enslave fellow brothers and sisters, Jewish people. And so not only did he do that, but he laid a heavy taxation on Israel that really caused a lot of bitterness and anger toward him. He also inaugurated corvée in Israel. That's a word that describes labor gangs were levied and forced to work in Lebanon, felling timber. We see this in 1 Kings 5:13. And so they had to go off and to produce all of this timber because of the building projects that King Solomon had. And so he really committed covenantal treason, is what it could be seen as, because it violated the covenant between Yahweh and David. And probably he is most remembered for the fact that his heart was led away by his many wives. God had commanded early on that to not take these wives to himself and to not marry these foreign women because they had foreign gods and that they would lead his heart astray. Well, he did not obey God. And it's interesting to see that this really wise man that God imparted great wisdom to, it didn't really help any of his wives, but his wicked wives drew him over to the wrong side. So that really causes us to stop and think about, in our relationships, are we obeying God? Because there's consequences to beginning deep relationships with people who have no commonality with you in terms of Christ. And so his heart was led away by his wives. Well, as a result of this, there was a kingdom split because God told him, if you do not obey me, I will rip the kingdom out of your hand and put them in another's hand. And that's exactly what God did. In 2 Chronicles chapter 10, we see this split occur. And we see that Solomon's son, Rehoboam, was, taking the kingdom, and he had gone up to Shechem, that's up to the north, to like solidify his coordination, if you will. And the people came out with a former leader his name was Jeroboam. This leader had worked with King Solomon, but he had drawn his hand against King Solomon. And because of that, Solomon was going to kill him, and Jeroboam fled to Egypt until Solomon's death. So Jeroboam was up there in the north, and so the people and Jeroboam comes to Rehoboam, and they say to him, listen, we need you to treat us with a little bit more kindness and understanding, and not put such a heavy yoke on us. And that was their request. And so Rehoboam said, well, come back to me in 3 days and I'll let you know my decision. And so Rehoboam goes to his father's elders who had served his father and asked, well, what kind of answer should I give these people? And so the elders whom had served King Solomon and had been tested for many years and probably had a level of wisdom, political wisdom at least, where they could advise him well, and because they had seen a few things. And so they told Rehoboam, listen, do what they ask for, just treat them with kindness and treat them fairly, and they will serve the king. They will serve you forever. Do that. Well, Rehoboam did not like the answer to those counselors, so he went to his own counselors. Now, the young counselors that he went to were the people who not only grew up with him, but served him in the palace. So these young counselors, number one, they were not tested counselors. They certainly didn't have God at the forefront of their thoughts, and they catered to Rehoboam. They knew what he wanted to hear, and they told him exactly what they thought he wanted to hear. And so they told him, listen, when you go back, you don't tell them what the elders said for you to say. Tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. He disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with barbed wire. So he was really told to double down on his harshness toward the people. And this was really demonic chatter, honestly, because it was oppressive to the people of Israel. It did not reflect the God Yahweh at all. And it was very purely self-motivated kind of counsel. And so that really helps us to understand we need to be careful who counsels us. If God is not part of that equation, and it doesn't match up with what God's word says, we really should not listen to that kind of counsel. Psalm chapter 1 talks about walking in the ways of wicked counselors. And so, well, Jeroboam, so he went back and he told them this to Israel, and so then pandemonium broke out. There was like a riot, and they murdered a few people, and Rehoboam he fled down to Judah, and he solidified southern Judah, and Jeroboam became the king of the northern rebellion. And that's all because Rehoboam did not listen to either the wise counselors, and he did not listen to the people. So Jeroboam became the king, but he also became a byword for evil. He naturally erected his own type of worship there in the northern kingdom, because the true worship was found at the temple in Jerusalem, and it was a rural Zion theology. It was centered there in Jerusalem, and it was to be part of the fabric of this theocracy in worshiping God. Well, he no longer had access to Jerusalem nor the temple, so he decided to renovate ancient sanctuaries at Bethel and Dan. And it's in these sanctuaries that he erected a calf and a bull images at both places. And so it was really just rank apostasy that he participated in. Jeroboam and his contemporaries wouldn't have seen it like that. They saw it in terms of cultic reform and renewal, which they were thinking they were going to get back to the pre-Davidic ideologies, more like the Moses and Aaronite priests. So he was basically going to do away with the entire Davidic program that God had prophesied and promised all of these hundreds of years, and he set up his own ways of worship. So that, of course, really created a deep cavern between the two entities, the North and the South. We see the Southern military immediately started to develop a military to deal with this northern insurrection, but it was quickly retracted because it was soon realized that Israel, the northern part, had 3 times more people, so they ended up having a bigger military. So the Rehoboam really just started solidifying what he could rule down in the south. He fortified different cities and built his military. But as a result, there was subsequent instability and insecurity in both nations, which lasted for a half century. So we see that soon the northern kingdom of Israel really gained the upper hand because they did have a lot more people, a bigger military. They also had strategic geographical position there on the trade routes that went right through northern Israel, the Megiddo area. It came from southern Egypt, was a big trading place, and Assyria up to the east, and those trading routes went right through Israel, which really delivered wealth to that area, and southern Judah was isolated from that activity. But along with these geographical positions, we see this traveling, this great influence of the external world into Israel. So the worship of these various gods, with Assyria and their gods and Egypt and their gods, really filtered, and also Phoenicia on the coast, really filtered into this northern kingdom. And this greater potential for international commerce was also accompanied by this spirituality of these other gods. So you see the mounting brotherly tension between the North and South really started to develop. Well, within 50 years or so, we see a great dynasty emerge in the north called the Omri dynasty, and that was in 885. And you see this dynasty emerge in 1 Kings 16, verse 15 through 2 Kings 8 through 27. We also see it in 2 Chronicles 17 through 20. You see the Omri dynasty emerge, and there was this guy called Omri, and he was this king, and he went in and he purchased Samaria. And he named it Samaria. It wasn't named Samaria at the time. He founded Samaria, and he named it after the former owner, who was Samri, I think was his name. And he named it Samaria. And he built up a palace there. He built up a lot of commerce there. There was in the Northern Kingdom. They had a lot of olive producing capability. They had war horses that they cultivated. So they had a wine press that was pretty substantial there as well. So that really developed a lot of financial benefits there. But with this, we see him really invite into the nation a deep, abiding worship of idolatry, the worship of Baal, Baal. Omri had a famous son named Ahab, and Omri was doing business with Phoenicia, and so a Phoenician king offered his daughter Jezebel to marry Omri's son Ahab so that they could develop a treaty there, and it was mutually advantageous for both Ahab and Jezebel. Well, Jezebel came into the nation, and she was a devout idolater. She really set up camp and really won her husband Ahab over, and systematically started implementing idolatry at the highest level of government. And she even was responsible for putting to death over 500 of God's prophets. And you see her activity with Elijah, where Elijah at one point was running for his life because she was just such a wicked woman. And so you really see during this Omri dynasty period a explosion of Baal worship and idolatry just in every crevice of society. So, along with the explosion of idolatry and the explosion of economic prosperity, you see on the spiritual and social end of it a decline in the way the poor people were treated. The poor people were placed at the mercy of the rich. And these poor, like I said, these poor landowners were compromised with their land and their families and ended up in slavery as a result of the corruptive activity that was going on and taking these people's lands, and they would go in front of these corrupt judges, and the judges would give the lands over to these rich people, making them richer and really creating just a terrible condition for those working poor people in the farmlands. Remember that they were working really hard. Their families worked very hard in their land, trying to carve out a life for them there. So the poor was actually forced to borrow with a rate that they really could not repay, and of course they ended up going into slavery. Well, all of this had a corrosive effect on both the northern and southern kingdoms. Well, at the same time, with this internal tensions going on between the North and the South, with all the political agendas and with all the spiritual decay, on the external end of everything, you really see an explosion political convulsions caused by this Assyrian campaign that was roaming throughout the ancient Near East region. And really, we can't underestimate the power of this regime and the power of this empire. The closest one that we have in near history that we could think about is probably the Nazi regime of the 20th century. We see that that regime was very powerful, and it rolled out very quickly with Blitzkrieg and Hitler taking over Poland. And the Germans really created quite the war machine. They had these tanks and panzers and tigers and these machines that were really well built and that could really take a lot of activity, and they really just rolled over everybody except for Britain. In terms of Britain, during the early 20th century, we see the Prime Minister Chamberlain. He was really toying with the idea of just let's let Hitler have his way, and then he'll let us have power, and then it'll be okay. Well, Churchill said, nope, when you give a tyrant an inch, he'll take a mile, and he was absolutely right. And of course, Britain really resisted, and later, of course, America came in. The U.S. came in because they were bombed during that time in Pearl Harbor. They came into the fight, but during all this time, prior to America entering the war, you see Hitler advancing toward Russia, and the only thing that stopped him was the Russian winter. It stopped all of his tanks in its track. They didn't have a good way to get food and materials to the soldiers, so it stopped them. But whereas we had the winter to stop Hitler, and we had this coalition of America and Britain, and of course Russia was part of that coalition to resist the Nazi regime. The Assyrians were very similar. They just rolled over everyone, and you did have coalitions that were rising up to resist them as well. So you see they had a rise in prominence, and it was characterized by subsequent highly competent leaders. Their leaders were just remarkable in terms of their competency. We really see that, prior to the time period that we're talking about, you saw some activity going on and growth in Assyrian Empire, but it had waned a little bit. And then with this new leader who had usurped the throne, his name was Tiglath-Pileser III. He usurped the throne in 744. In 745, and he was a highly competent leader. He knew what he wanted. He had his T's crossed and his I's dotted. He had his ducks in a row, and he hit the ground running. He was organized. He organized the government. He forced some of the defiant Assyrian officials into submission. And he had 3 set goals, and that was defending the Assyrian borders against Urartu to the north, and number 2, he wanted to regain control over Syria to the west, and he wanted to subdue Babylon to the south. And so he knew what he was doing. So in that vein, toward that goal, he developed efficient and competent army with equipment and technique and tactics superior to all of his enemies, including the people in Israel, the people in Phoenicia, and even the Egyptian powers. He developed swift strategies to overwhelm his enemies. One of the distinctives to Tiglath-Pileser III is his Assyrian foreign policy. It was really brilliant. He had 3 stages that he would put regions through. Stage 1 was for those regions and those people who would volunteer their submission. They would really not feel much of the sting of the Assyrian sword if they first volunteered their submission and they paid tribute to Assyria, and they also had to furnish auxiliary troops. And they also had to support the Syrian interest. If you were able to do those 4 things, then you would be okay. Assyria would be okay with you. But the second stage were for those people that had some level of resistance. So stage two, they would take your rulers if you had that resistance, and they would appoint a new ruler from a native royal house that was trustworthy. If they could keep the native people in ruling, they really tried to do that. But that person would have to be trustworthy. But in this stage two, your territory was reduced, and some of the upper class people were deported to different regions, and other upper class were brought into that region. And also in this stage two, there was an increase in tribute and military presence. So you see. There's a lot of consequences that started building when you resisted the Assyrian Empire in their campaign. Well, both Israel and Judah went through all three stages of this, and so the third stage was the worst stage. So the third stage was when you were red-handed anarchy against the Assyrian Empire. And if you were caught in this stage, the vassal ruler was removed. Political independence was completely revoked. The territory became Assyrian province with Assyrian officials, and deportation of the upper class replaced with all kinds of different foreigners. And this was what was really part of the brilliant strategy of Tiglath-Pileser III. He would take large groups of people and take them captive and put them in different regions and repopulate the area with different people. And he did that to unhinge people from their fidelity to not only their land and their government, but also their gods. And so this is one way to break that dependence and to break that self-political identity. So both Israel and Judah became vassal states, and both of them really went through all three stages. But during this push by the Assyrians in the ancient Near East, the internal tensions between northern Israel and southern Judah really collapsed with a civil war that was brought on by the Syro-Ephraimitic coalition. So, like I had mentioned this earlier, the coalition was developed from parts of Egypt, Syria, and also King Pekah, who was king of Israel at the time. They were building this coalition, and this really was taking shape, but it ran into a difficulty. Judah did not want to join this coalition. Well, that was a problem for Israel and for all of the people in this alliance, because they didn't need someone at their back door that they had to be concerned about when they're resisting Assyria. So what they tried to do is they tried to replace King Ahaz. So we had King Rezin of Damascus and King Pekah of Israel, and Syria really run against the southern kingdom in a civil war that aligned against King Ahaz of Judah, because they wanted to replace him and put in a king that would support their agenda. Well, Isaiah had warned that the very popular prophet Isaiah, he warned King Ahaz, do not give in to this coalition. Stand against him and put your trust in Yahweh. Well, King Ahaz did not give in and cave to this coalition, although they had really invaded and did some damage to them. But King Ahaz didn't follow the second part of obeying what Isaiah had said, which is trust in Yahweh. Instead of trusting in Yahweh, he decided to run to Assyria and ask to have an alliance with Assyria, with Tiglath-Pileser III and the subsequent kings in that region. And of course, they got an understanding of this coalition, and although that helped Ahaz in the short term, it did not help him in the long term. Well, as a result, um, they were weakened by the civil war, and because Assyria found out about this coalition, Assyria used its entire force against Israel, which literally led to an annihilation of the northern kingdom as a political entity permanently. They swept them literally off of the face of the earth. And then they turned toward Judah. Uh, and they turned toward Judah, and they started a siege against the fortified cities in Judah. And they were successful up until Jerusalem. They did not take Jerusalem because God said they would not take Jerusalem. God was going to protect Jerusalem because that was the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, and that would be the line where the Messiah would come from. So God protected them. So if it had not been for God, even Jerusalem would have been taken. So Micah witnessed all of this activity. He witnessed the Assyrian invasion in Judah, in Israel, early on in 722, and also Judah in 701. So he saw all this stuff going on. So to realize kind of to rehearse what we've gone through over this last few minutes is we see Assyrian campaign was positioned with invasion, conquer, and relocation. And you see the Assyrian foreign policy of stage 1, 2, and 3 really work its magic in the region. And you can really get a feel of the political, economic, and social convulsions that were going were taking place at the time of Micah. But I want to draw your attention to the fact, and Amos 3:7 tells us this, that indeed the Lord God does nothing without revealing his counsel to his servants, the prophets. So if you were to go and read Isaiah chapter 1, and Hosea chapter 1, Amos chapter 1, and Micah chapter 1, you'd really get the sense that God is helping draw up his people, his prophets, to deliver this message to his people, what the coming judgment is going to be, but also the coming hope. And this is a part of the hope that we really do gather here as we do this study in the Old Testament. A lot of people are under the understanding that the Old Testament is just such a negative place, and it's just not a place that you want to spend a lot of time in. But that's a place where you really get to know God as a whole, and you get to know things that happen in history to his people that really, as we can see today, people have not changed, have they? People are still the same no matter what generation they're in. And so we have a word that we can garner from God, from Micah. And really, there are 3 principles that we can gather from just surveying that quick history of Israel and Judah. And that is, an external crisis will expose your spiritual condition. So just like on a national level, that the external crisis that was going on with Assyria and all the things that were happening in the upheaval, well, it was exposing some of the conditions that had been going on for hundreds of years. It exposed the spiritual condition of God's people. So, and just like we have experienced this many crises over the last year, it has exposed some of the problems that we're facing in our families that we've not dealt with, right? And that's why we have an epidemic of family issues going on right now, because an external crisis will expose the weaknesses that have been allowed to be continued in our lives. But on a very personal level, you see that a crisis, any crisis that you go to, actually uncovers what's in your own heart. So you can pretend a long time to be a certain way, but when you go through a crisis, that really brings out what's actually in our hearts. And that's why the Bible tells us to protect our hearts, because from it flows the issues of life. And Jesus tells us that that corruption is not what we do externally necessarily, but it's what comes out of us. That's why we do what we do. So external crises will expose your spiritual condition. Principle number 2 is God is in control of global events. We see this in Daniel chapter 2:20. And we see this if we were to survey the whole Bible, we see that God is control of the global events. We sometimes get in our little Christian denominations, and we don't see what's going on in the bigger picture. And sometimes we may be tempted to feel like everything seems like total chaos and that God's not in control of anything. But that's where you are wrong. God is actually in control of all the events from the beginning of time to the very end of time. So we don't have the mind of God. We cannot possibly understand the connections between the beginning of time and the end of time and what God's after. So we need to trust and understand that God is actually in control, and we have a part to play in our little influences of our own lives in the grand scheme of things. And finally, the third one is God prepares his leaders to lead in dire times. That's a really important thing to understand, because God is about his business, and he is going to raise up his people to fight against false prophets, to fight against the things that do not represent the God of the Bible. So we would be very wise to really understand the Old Testament along with the New Testament, so that we can understand God, so we can understand ourselves and understand the times and discern the times in which we live. We live in very interesting times, and we all have a part to play, and we certainly do not want to be a foghorn for a political agenda or political ideologies that are not a part of the Bible. We are children of God, and we need to conduct ourselves and understand things in that framework. So I hope that you will join this study and take time to listen to this material and read along with Micah. Read some of those Old Testament minor prophets as well. I will try to assign you some reading each week. So this week, go and read the Hosea chapter 1, Micah chapter 1. Even go read some of Jonah. Jonah's part of that fabric as well. And Hosea chapter 1. And that will start helping you to understand things a little bit better. Well, that was a lot to say. I hope that you got it all, and I hope that you will be on this journey with me. If you like this, please go ahead and like it down in the box down there, and subscribe to this channel. You'll get these things as they roll out. So share, subscribe, and like, and there'll be a lot more to come. Thanks a lot. Have a great day. Bye.